Good Vibrations.
Welcome back to Good Vibrations. I've got two guests today talking about a subject which is very pertinent and very relevant to the situation that we all find ourselves in. I've got Dawn Lester and David Parker, who are the joint authors of a new book called What Really Makes You Ill? Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease is Wrong. So it turns out to have been quite prophetic timing for this book dropping when it did, just before this current narrative all went off the chart. So really good to have Dawn and David on the line today. Welcome, folks.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's lovely to be able to talk to you.
Yeah, definitely. Hi, Mark.
Well, what else would we be doing today?
Quite.
So, yeah, the timing of your book turned out to be quite portentous, didn't it, in the end? Not that I guess you knew it would be.
No, we didn't, because we actually have been working on this book for 10 years, would you believe? Because it's and that's why it's sort of an 800-page tome with 40 pages of references. So it's a big book. So yeah, we started writing this a long time before this present situation, shall we say, appeared on the scene, and we sort of released it about Christmas time, 2019. So literally just before this. Chaos hit the world. So absolutely. So yeah, you know, we believe in these things, so things come along at the right time. So it's working out well. Absolutely. So what inspired you to write this book in the first place? What was the process that led to that, just briefly? Okay, well, it literally was from personal experiences, particularly in my life with friends and family who'd over the years had been diagnosed with cancers of various types, and who had all taken the prescribed treatments, whether it's chemotherapy, radiotherapy, done exactly what the doctors had said, and they all died. So and as I've often said to people, but I had one relative, elderly lady, who quite rightly refused to have anything to do with the medical establishment. She'd been diagnosed with a cancer, but she wouldn't have any treatment. She said, "I'll just, it'll be whatever it is." And over a period of a year, 2 years maybe, because they kept monitoring her, they said to her, "Well, we're pleased to tell you that your cancer's completely gone." So that was the first real big thing where I thought, well, there's something terribly wrong here. All the people that I know, close family and friends, that did exactly what they were told, took the treatments, all died. And the one lady who said, "I'm having nothing to do with you, medical establishment," lived. So I think that was the real kick-off point for me. I mean, Dawn and I have known one another for many years, and we've written a couple of other books before this one. So, and one of the books we were writing, which was actually about the nature of reality, so nothing to do with medical things, but in it, one of the chapters we needed some information on viruses. And up until that point, although we started to have suspicions about all was not well with the medical establishment, we started to look into viruses because we needed information for that book. And the more we looked into it, the more we realised that everything we thought about the medical establishment being based on an exact science, we realised that was not the case. And the more we dug, the more we realised that was the case. So we decided that a book needed to be written about it, because we were quite shocked, because up until that point, like everyone else, we thought the medical establishment knew what it was doing, because they told us they did, and they wore white coats, of course, so anyone in a white coat knows what they're talking about. And we started to look, and one of the first things we examined, purely by chance, was the HIV/AIDS epidemic, so-called. And we started to look into that and realised there was a big controversy as to quite whether a virus had ever been isolated, and quite what the actual circumstances of the AIDS epidemic was. We could see the governments of the world was telling us it was, the worst thing that had ever happened, and there was going to be millions and millions worldwide die from it, whether you were homosexual or heterosexual. It was everyone was going to die. It was one of these doomsday predictions, which of course never came to pass. And I think it was based on the same sort of modelling that Neil Ferguson, is it? Professor Neil Ferguson? I think it was based on the same modelling as he's used for the present situation. And that's not accurate either.
Well, I'm sure we were all very sorry to see him leave his post this week. It was all very sad.
Absolutely. I'm sure it couldn't have happened to a nicer chap.
Yeah, it's funny how these things come and go, isn't it? Because I remember the AIDS panic back in the 80s, and as you rightly say, a lot of people just felt it was going to wipe everyone out and it would be, the end of the world as we know it, but it went away very quickly, as things do. For instance, what's happened to ISIS? Daesh, whatever the hell they're called these days. Not many terror attacks lately. And you would think that with the world in the grip of this pandemic and everyone inside their homes on lockdown, out of view, it would be the ideal opportunity for these die-hard jihadi terrorists who are prepared to give their lives for their cause to launch some attack or other. But strangely, we don't get that.
No,
interesting, that, isn't it?
And also the climate change, which was the only thing the news could talk about, wasn't it? Because we're all doomed because the planet was going to die. But suddenly that's not important anymore because so no one's talking about it. So interesting.
And we also don't get to hear much about Jeffrey Epstein anymore and Prince Andrew's links to him or any of that stuff. That's all gone now as well. Funny thing, that.
Yes.
So that's what sort of got us working on it. And when we realised that the more we looked into just that first AIDS thing, we realised that there was no scientific evidence behind it. And we sort of came across work by Kary Mullis, who invented the PCR, got his Nobel Prize for it. And he also we found that he looked into to see what the original papers were, if they existed, to prove that a virus had been isolated and fully categorized to show its genetic makeup. And he realized also that those papers don't exist. There's all sorts of information that suggests they have, but when you actually look for them, they're not there. And we found this time and time again, that the actual science is not there. It's all based on assumptions and dogma, really. And the more we looked into whatever the medical establishment said about any diseases that you'd like to mention, we found the same thing. It's all built on assumptions. And we got to talk to a few doctors. Obviously, privately they would admit all sorts of things, but publicly they wouldn't go on public record because they knew they would lose their job. But now, as you may have heard, we've become quite friends with a doctor in America, Dr. Andy Kaufman, who's gone very public. It's cost him his job, but he's still an MD. They haven't taken his license off him, but he's gone very public and agrees with everything we've come up with. He has got a copy of our book, so he knows exactly what we believe, and he's found it all to be true himself. And he's admitted to us that when he was going through medical college, the way they were taught is that they'd be given, certain sort of fundamental things, that this disease is caused by that bacteria and this disease is caused by this virus. But they were never given access to the information that proved any of those cases. They were just told, it's fait accompli, that this is what it is. And so he said they never, of course, check it themselves and go back and say, well, I'd like to see the experiments, or I'd like to do the experiments myself to see how this virus stroke bacteria has been isolated. They never do that themselves, of course. They just don't have time. So they just accept what they're told. And as we found, that's the way their training works. So as we hasten to point out, it's not that we set out to attack doctors and make them out to be evil people. They're just doing what they're taught. And as we know, if someone's taught the wrong things, they're going to end up doing the wrong things, just purely by ignorance. And this is another thing that we were able to break, this sort of mystique around doctors, that they know everything and that everything they say is correct. And our book, as unintentionally, but it does show that no, doctors don't know what they're talking about. They only know what they've been taught, and what they've been taught is wrong. And so we decided that we would start by asking the most basic question, which is what really makes you ill, and not take anything for granted, no matter who was saying it, whether it was a doctor or the government or any scientist you care to mention. We only looked for the evidence, and if the evidence wasn't there, then we knew that it was unfounded.
Well, I've heard it said that doctors spend about half a day in their training learning about nutrition, which is a pretty bloody important subject when it comes to keeping people well, and it seems the rest of their time is spent learning about big pharma, drugs, and being told which big pharma products to push for certain symptoms. So that's shocking if that's the truth. I challenged my own doctor a while back, actually, on the question of vaccines. I had a routine appointment with my regular GP, and at the end of the conversation I just said to him, I want to ask you about some of the ingredients in vaccines. And I could see from his reaction that he was getting defensive straight away. And I said, can you just tell me why it's a good idea to have things like mercury in there and aborted fetal tissue and formaldehyde and stuff like this? And he just immediately went on the defensive and said, oh, well, it's safe and they wouldn't put it in there if it was doing any harm. And I said, well, I've been doing some research of my own. And he said, oh, well, I wouldn't believe everything you see on the internet. We've had training, you know, and we know about these things. So there's a glimpse there into the mindset of mainstream doctors who are taught to think that the training they've got is the gospel truth, and anything that conflicts with it can just be thrown out straight away because it's not part of what they've been told.
Exactly. I mean, I often, speaking of vaccinations, as we know, there's a whole section in the book about it, but yeah, there's some pretty dreadful things in it. But, you know, a quick rule of thumb, as I often point out to people, that, you know, it's within the doctor's surgery, if they were to drop the hypodermic on the floor and it broke, the contents has to be treated as toxic waste in the cleanup exercise. And that must be a pretty strong clue, I would think, to think, well, if that has to be treated as toxic waste, it's got no business being in my bloodstream.
Absolutely.
You know, but
I want to talk to you about germ theory, because it seems that much of the training that doctors receive is based around what is just a theory, and a theory, of course, is something that's not been proven. It's a hypothesis. It's somebody's idea. But germ theory is credited to Louis Pasteur back in the 1860s, I think, who I've heard you say was a chemist and not actually a doctor. So he put forward this idea of how germs and bacteria and viruses work, and this would appear to be a fundamentally flawed axiom, as it turns out. And the problem with axioms is that so much gets built around them, and if they're accepted as a truth, then all kinds of layers get put on top of it. And by the time you've got to several layers down the line, nobody thinks to question whether the axiom was correct in the first place. And so most modern medicine seems to be built around the validity of the germ theory idea, doesn't it?
It does indeed. In fact, it is, as you say, the fundamental building block of the whole medical system. You know, and you take that foundation stone away and the whole house of cards falls down. And really, that's what we found, and you're quite right. It is still called a germ theory, i.e. something that's not proven, which, as we look back, and we went back into the history of it, again, which is detailed in the book, we went back into it, and yes, although the germ theory was starting to be put together before Pasteur's time, which is, as you say, about 150 years ago, various people had looked at some sort of theory to try and come up with what was making people ill. But at the time, they only had optical microscopes, so they could only see certain things within the bloodstream. And at that time, it was the things they could see were bacteria. And that was where they made their first fundamental mistake, because whenever you looked into the blood through an optical microscope, wherever there was sort of dead or dying tissue, there was clusters of bacteria around it. And so they made the assumption that it was the bacteria that was attacking the cells and was obviously therefore causing the illness. But that is just not the case. And as we point out in the book, it's akin to blaming firemen for house fires just because you always see them clustered around a house fire. You know, so they just made that fundamental mistake. And lots of things started to be built on that. Lots of sort of medical practices started to be built on that of, okay, well, we've got to find something to kill this bacteria. And they caused all sorts of problems and made people ill and killed people as well with the things that they started to do. And then in the 1930s onwards, they invented the electron microscope so that they could see even smaller particles within the blood. And then they saw these other things, which they named viruses, which is a corruption of a Latin word. Originally, virus meant poison or toxic material. So they've sort of corrupted it and started to use it to call these little particles, which are actually just protein, tiny protein particles. But again, they made the assumption that these were the things that were, if they found them in the blood, that these were the things that were causing illnesses. But they never did any of the basic tests, and they still don't do it today, where they've actually proved that. You know, there's three standard things that they need to do really to prove whether a virus is the cause of a disease, and that is to firstly isolate it, then take an electron micrograph of it, and then to determine what its genetic makeup is, to fully categorize what its genetic makeup is, and then to be able to prove that that particular isolated virus is the cause of the disease that is attributed to it. But they've never done that, ever. And that again was a great shock, and that's the same today, and they've certainly never done it with this present situation that we're in, you know, and you can challenge, and we do challenge anyone to produce those papers. And it's not, well, as I mentioned earlier, Gary Mullis, you know, a scientist, a true scientist, looked for those for the HIV/AIDS fiasco, and they weren't there. And as we've often said to people, you know, being able to produce and get your name on an original paper to prove this virus does this is, you know, it's a big deal within the medical establishment. You know, they get all sorts of honours and promotions and extra money and go down in the Hall of Fame in the medical establishment. So, you know, if anybody had done this for any virus, their names would be there and those papers would be easy to find, and they're not. So that's the first clue that, well, if these papers don't exist, that means the work's not been done. And if the work's not been done, what on earth are they basing all these things on? What are they basing vaccinations on, which is supposed to prevent you getting a virus? What are they basing the various medicines they give to people, which is supposed to kill these viruses, when they've never isolated one and they've never proved that one actually causes anything? And this is an amazing thing. But of course, certain individuals, certain families, and we're going right back to the beginning, and we're going back to, say, the Rockefeller family and their petroleum industry, started to realise that there was money to be made in all of this. And that's why, as today, most pharmaceutical products are petroleum-based when you look into them, and there's a very good reason for that. And of course, the pharmaceutical companies own, either wholly or partially, all the medical training schools. So you start to see why doctors' training is based around prescribing drugs, which the pharmaceutical companies manufacture.
Absolutely.
So you can quite see why we're in the dreadful situation that we're in today.
Right, let me hit you with a really big question, and Dawn, maybe you want to take this. This is very pertinent to the times in which we find ourselves as well. Is there any such thing as an airborne contagious virus that somebody coughing and spluttering in the queue next to you at Lidl can pass on to you?
The short answer is no. The particles, as David said, they're pieces of genetic material in a protein coating. But one of the main things that viruses are not are living. They are not alive. They do not have many of the characteristics that something that would be called living have. They don't. They're just not alive. They don't have metabolism. They don't eat. They don't excrete or anything. They don't have the ability to determine to fly in the air and say, right, I'm going to attack that person and crawl up their nose. It just that's just not the case. And so they're not even living. So even if they were particles that they could discover in the atmosphere, there's no evidence that they ever come out of anybody's orifices when they sneeze, cough, and there's no evidence that they could actually travel into your body and get to the cells to destroy them, even if you did breathe them in.
So this is making a complete mockery of the idea of social distancing and the wearing of masks, and this would mean that the whole lockdown pantomime that we're all going through is completely and utterly useless. We're all acting out these absurd rituals every time we go out for absolutely no reason, and most people will probably never even come to discover that this has been the case. So instead you've got people losing their minds at another human being approaching them on the pavement, and they're jumping into traffic to get away from them because they think if they breathe on them they could get this deadly virus that's just everywhere, you know, it could just come out of their nostrils and go up theirs. And you've got people shouting at other people in the supermarket for standing too close to them and going the wrong way around the aisles. And all of this is just completely and utterly redundant, useless and pointless then. And we're going through all this ridiculous behaviour for absolutely no reason.
Absolutely,
yes.
Yeah. I mean, they did some years ago, and this was the medical establishment in America, they did some experiments to try and see whether they could pass the flu from infected people to healthy people. You know, and this is on the records. We detail it in the book, but I'll just give you the outline of it. And this is the medical establishment we're talking about. They sort of lined up groups of infected people who'd got heavy flu symptoms, and they had them sit directly opposite healthy people and cough a number of times directly into their face. Yeah, it sounds disgusting. Well, it is disgusting. But they did this a number of times. So each person with the flu coughed at least 10 times into the face of a healthy person. And they did this over quite a number of people. And at the end of the experiment, not one of the healthy people contracted the flu. So that was quite a decent experiment, I think, to show that there was obviously no germs being coughed through the air into these people to give them a disease. And then of course there's another famous case where you may have heard, I think he's becoming more and more famous, Dr. Stefan Lanka, German doctor, only about 3 years ago, challenged the medical establishment to prove, if they could, that a virus caused measles. And he offered at the time €100,000, so quite a princely sum. Cut a long story short, the medical establishment obviously threw all their big guns at it, and they had 2 court cases. But in the end, because it went to the Supreme Court in Germany, highest court in the land, and they ruled in Stefan Lanka's favour that the medical establishment were unable to prove that a virus causes measles. Now, as I've often said to people, that should have made world headlines, because, you're going to say, well, what on earth are vaccinations against measles for then, if there's no virus causing it? But to make the matters even worse, I've seen that the German government, in spite of that ruling being in their own Supreme Court, only this month in Germany have mandated that all school children have to be vaccinated against measles. So it just shows you that governments don't work on science. They say they do. It's a racket. They say they do, like our government in the UK is saying that they work on science, but they don't. They do what suits them, or should I say what they're told to do, as you well know. And Germany's a prime example. As I say, the Supreme Court says, no, there is no virus that causes measles, but yet they mandate that children have to be vaccinated against measles, which makes a complete mockery of science, to be honest.
Well, just this whole... Sorry, Dawn, you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say it's not just measles that Stefan Lanka says is not caused by a virus. I mean, he's stated quite categorically that no disease has ever been proven to be caused by any virus. In other words, there are no such things as diseases caused by viruses. So, that's quite definitive, that his training, although he doesn't call himself a virologist anymore, but his training was in virology, and that's quite a big statement for somebody with that background. But he said he's looked for the papers, and there are no original papers that show that any virus is the cause of any disease. So that's all of them. And obviously with vaccinations based on the idea that viruses do cause them, I mean, obviously vaccinations predate the Pasteur germ theory, but that's a whole other matter. But they started on the basis that if somebody had a mild form of a disease, that would prevent them from getting a more serious form of disease. So that's the origin of vaccination. But the germ theory really enabled the medical establishment to really get that kind of vaccination, or that the idea of vaccinations preventing infectious diseases, that really helped them. So they've gone together now, and so pulling the rug from under the germ theory will pull the rug from under the vaccination programs as well.
I do want to get into vaccinations shortly some more, actually, but just picking up on what David was saying, that we can know that the governments of the world are not making independent, autonomous decisions for their countries just by looking at how the vast majority of the world went into lockdown with exactly the same measures, social distancing, keeping 2 meters away from the next person, only go out to get essential supplies and for exercise and stuff, in every country around the world pretty much at the same time. So do we really believe that all these individual governments all thought to themselves, yeah, this is a good idea, we need to do this right now? Or is it more likely that all these governments are controlled by higher-ups who give them directions on what to do, and it won't just be politicians, it will be medical professionals and academic professionals and people in all kinds of institutions who are directed in what to do and say. And we all come to these realizations in different ways. With me, it was looking at how the music industry is controlled, having been a DJ myself. So I came to realize that the entertainment industry is used as a vehicle for mind control and societal programming and all this. Then there'll be other people who realize that the medical establishment is a big racket, and it's completely controlled and it's using bad science, and that will wake them up to the bigger picture of what's really going on in the world. And all these different institutions are controlled by the same forces, and we all come to this realization in different ways. And so the more information about this that gets out, the more chance there is of many more people coming to these grudging, difficult realizations as well. And just picking up on Dr. Andy Kaufman, as you said, he's been a very prominent voice over the past few weeks. He's done a ton of interviews giving his view on what viruses really are. So does your research tally with his? And did you come to your conclusions independent of him, and then you came to discover that you were both pretty much on the same page?
Yes, because as I say, we'd been writing this book for the last 10 years, and we did were invited onto his show. I think it was Greg.
No, it was Crow.
We did several, but that was it, on the Crow 777. So we were invited on to his show, and had a very successful interview there. And Dr. Andy Kaufman heard our interview and wanted to get in touch with us. And because it became quite obvious, we'd never heard of him before, it became quite obvious that, as Crow said, that Dr. Andy Kaufman agreed with everything we said. And then when Dr. Andy Kaufman did get in touch with us, which was very soon after that, to let us know that he'd got our book, and he was thrilled with it, and he said he wished he'd have got it earlier, it would have saved him a lot of research. So, which was quite a nice thing. So, yes, we'd done all the research a long time ago, and Dr. Andy Kaufman was sort of pleased to have it, and has found that there's nothing that he takes exception to. There are one or two things that we do disagree on, but they're fairly minor, and that's whether you really need to eat meat or not. But there's various things that but we explain all those reasonings in the book about how you get nutrition and what you need and the quantities you need.
Are you of the view that we do need to eat meat then, or that we don't?
No, you don't need to eat meat, and that's not to say we're not being prescriptive about it and saying don't eat it, but Dawn and I are both vegetarians through choice and have been for decades.
Yeah, me too. 32 years vegetarian and about 6 years vegan, and I'm in fine health.
Exactly.
Yes.
Well,
and we are too. So
we are too, and for even longer periods, we're sort of somewhat older, but still very healthy. And so, living proof you don't need to eat meat. But we explain we're very much in favour of natural diets, and it's not that we're sort of trying to sell veganism or vegetarianism. We've looked at what natural health is all about, and what the records show, what the body needs, and how it can get it. So we look at methods for doing that, and that's why one of the reasons we sort of recommend a plant-based diet and organic if possible. And this is purely because of the way the soils have been treated by sort of modern day farming, and many of the soils that they grow the crops in have been depleted of the natural minerals that would normally have been there, particularly magnesium, and because they're grown basically in chemicals. So if the plants that are growing in that soil can't uptake the necessary minerals because the soil's dead basically, even though the crops may look good, but when you come to eat them, you wouldn't be able to uptake those vitamins and minerals yourself because the plant doesn't have them anymore. So again, if you try and get as much organic stuff as you can, then because the soil control is much greater, then you're much more likely to get healthy fruit and veg. And it's just purely for that reason. And because again, looking at modern farming methods with animals, whether it's poultry or cattle, again, they're under this same stupid regime where they're going to inject their cattle with all sorts of antibiotics and growth hormones and various other sorts of things, which again is going to be in the meat which you're going to eat. And one of the things that we did, when we were doing these investigations, we looked at animal illnesses as well. Because we wanted to see whether the same rules applied or whether it was just to human beings. And we found that exactly the same rules apply. And we looked at various test cases, not least of which was mad cow disease, which was quite prevalent, as you know, in the UK, but seemed to be non-existent anywhere else. So we thought, well, what's actually happening? Why are these cows apparently going mad and dying, or being slaughtered by the ministry? And cutting a long story short, what we found was that in the UK, the government and stroke veterinary systems insisted that UK farmers dipped their cattle in a dip which was high of, huge doses of organophosphates, much more than in any other country. And the organophosphates attack the nervous system. And this is what gave the appearance of cows going mad, and eventually dying. So, but all of that, of course, was kept quiet by the government and the ministry for obvious reasons. When the truth, I hope one day it does come out, there are people like us that know about this. Obviously, the government is open to getting sued for huge sums of money because they cost the livelihood of many farmers and the loss of tens of thousands of livestock. But again, it was nothing to do with a disease, it was to do with poisoning. And this is time and time again that we came across this, even myxomatosis in rabbits. So we looked at a whole range of things, not only what was the cause of disease in humans, but what was the cause of disease in animals. And we found the same things. And it all boils down, we detail all this in the book, boils down to 4 factors, basically. And those 4 factors are lack of nutrition, sufficient nutrition, toxic intake, high levels of sustained stress, and electromagnetic radiation, which is quite a big thing in itself. I know we're not allowed to mention certain words, which just shows the seriousness of the censorship that's going on in the UK at the moment.
I heard you on a previous broadcast, it was on Greg Carwood's Higher Side Chats, addressing these factors and what really makes people ill. And I heard you address the question that people often pose, which is, okay, if a virus isn't contagious and you can't make someone else ill by breathing on them or coughing and spluttering over them, then how come members of the same family can often get ill at the same time? And you address that by saying, well, if you look at what some of the factors could could be in terms of people falling ill. Members of the same household are going to be exposed to the same factors, so we shouldn't be surprised when they express themselves in terms of the same ailments coming out at the same time. And this could be things like most people now have a wireless router in their house. A lot of people have smart meters in the house, so there's electromagnetic pollution going on there and radiation. Maybe people live close to a mobile phone tower, transmitter. There's poor diet as well. You know, if members of the same family are eating the same kind of food and it's crap, then you can expect the same effects to be taking place on each member. And then there'll be answers as to why people fall ill at the same time at certain times of the year. You know, we have seasonal flu, and people tend to catch colds at certain times of the year, mainly the winter. So from what I can see, it's the times of the year where people don't have a lot of access to direct sunlight. They're not getting the vitamin D from the sun, they're not getting the fresh air, they're not out in nature because it's cold, they're indoors with their heating cranked up. And so it goes back to what Dr. Andrew Kaufman talks about. He's got his term exosomes, which he says are the cells of the body. It's their way of getting rid of toxic material that it's absorbed, and the body basically sheds this material, and it expresses itself in the symptoms that we associate with the flu or the common cold. It's the body's way of getting rid of crap that it doesn't want in it, and it's a very personal experience, so it goes on in your body alone, and it's not something that you can pass on to somebody else. So maybe you just want to speak to that.
Sure, yeah. Yes, the body, we come back to the body. The body is very capable of looking after itself if you address those four factors that I've just mentioned, particularly nutrition. Because there's all the mechanisms that I just mentioned, to try and keep this as short as I can. During the normal day and normal activity, the body produces free radicals. Now, these free radicals, if left unattended, as it were, can be quite destructive in the body at cellular level. And but the body, with the correct levels of nutrition, and certainly during hours of darkness when you should be sleeping, it releases other powerful antioxidants like melatonin. And these sweep up, if you like, the free radicals, and they're dispelled through the body. And one of the jobs of bacteria do this, and these things that you mentioned, exosomes, which are released from the cells, these are all part of the body's natural cleanup mechanism, and the body stays healthy. But if for some reason you've not got a good diet, or you've got excess intake of toxins or electromagnetic radiation, the body can get overwhelmed. It can't get rid of these free radicals because it's generating even more of them from the bad stuff, if you like, that's coming into the body. Nothing to do with germs, just to do with toxicity of one sort or another. And the body can get overwhelmed. Now, quite often the first sign that your body's trying to detox itself is when you get what people think of as a cold or flu symptoms, being one of the more severe it is. It's when the body's normal mechanisms of getting rid of these toxins is having to work overtime. So quite often it employs the mucous membranes, hence this sort of catarrhal effect that people get, where the body is trying to use these extra resources that it has to try and scoop up these free radicals and the toxins and get them out of the body. So it's actually a natural detoxing system. But if you've kept your body okay, you'll never have those symptoms, because those are when it's gone to an extreme measures. And I know from our own experience, knowing what we know, we don't ever suffer from cold symptoms or flu symptoms because we keep our body sort of well nourished enough and away from, as much as you can nowadays, from the toxic inputs from electromagnetic radiation as much as you can, but that's getting very difficult. But particularly from processed food, which has lots of toxins in it, and water supplies. I mean, we use reverse osmosis filtering systems on our water supplies because there's a lot of toxicity in the water. I mean, the UK in many areas has now added ammonia, so not being satisfied with fluoride and chlorine in the water as additives, it's now put ammonia in it in some areas. And plus as well, because the filtration plants at source are not really all that good. So you can get all sorts of other effluents, pharmaceutical waste and things like that in your water system.
Don't drink tap water, folks.
Basically, yeah, don't drink tap water unless you've got, as I say, a reverse osmosis system on it, or some other a really good system to take out these impurities. And that doesn't mean I'm advocating bottled water, because that you're going to be just as bad, if not worse off, with that, because of the I think it's BPA in the plastic leaches into the water in those bottles, and you're actually taking in some quite nasty toxins from bottled water. So just make sure you filter your water very well.
Just coming back to the question of vaccines then, so if viruses aren't what we think they are, then presumably vaccines can never be effective. So there's no such thing as a vaccine that does you any good. Do you want to take this one, Dawn?
Well, the simple answer is true, absolutely. The whole basis of vaccination is to boost the immune system so that the body can fight these so-called invading germs. But the fact that there's no evidence whatsoever that any germs invade the body says that there's no purpose for the activities of the immune system. I mean, the mechanisms attributed to it just doesn't happen. The body is not a battleground where the immune system has to fight off these invaders.
Some of the crap they put in vaccines, your body is never going to be exposed to that stuff ordinarily, left to its own devices. So you're having all this stuff put into you, and it's toxic and it's poisonous, and you would never ordinarily encounter it. So they've got to be doing more harm than good.
Yes, the purpose of the toxic ingredients, especially the adjuvants, is to actually make the immune system work harder. So I think the idea is, it's toxic, so it'll supercharge the immune system to work harder. But it's based on a completely erroneous idea that the germs are invaders. And to explain that, I mean, obviously with viruses not even being alive, people think, oh yes, but what about bacteria? No, because you can pick up bacteria everywhere, and they're the cause of diseases, aren't they? And the answer is no, they're not either, because a lot of people will find this horrible, but the body's contained trillions of bacteria, about the same number of cells about the same number of bacteria as cells, and so it's the normal habitat of bacteria. So when scientists have a look under, in their laboratories, and they find there are bacteria in this diseased tissue, it's not surprising. But then, as David said before, one of the purposes of bacteria is to be the cleanup agents, to break down toxic materials and help the body release them into, out of the body and away. So as they're part of the cleanup system, they're not the enemy.
But there is a fallacy as well, as we found, in this whole concept of an immune system, which again vaccination is built on, that it boosts your immune system. We've probably all heard this many times. That's what it's done. But the body, and this may sound surprising, the body doesn't actually have an immune system in the way that we're taught. What it has is a health system. The body has the mechanisms, and we've discussed some of them just for keeping its system clear, but there is no mechanism in the body that you can pre-treat, if you like, to boost it up.
Yeah, it's individual organs like the spleen and the kidney and the liver, and they all have their own functions and they all do their own thing.
Absolutely, and you can't give them something to make them work better in some way. The body just doesn't work that way. So the whole thing about vaccinations, whatever way you look at it, and there's many people looked at vaccinations, and we discuss them in our book in detail, there is just no mechanism for them to work, either to boost this illusory immune system or to prevent diseases against something that doesn't exist. It's a complete nonsense and a very dangerous one, because all they're doing is putting toxins into the body which have no rights to be there, and they're bypassing the first form of defense of the body, which is the skin. And so they're injecting toxins, bypassing that protective shield, if you like, and putting stuff straight into the bloodstream that would never have otherwise got there.
That's right. And there's other stuff going into them reportedly now as well, according to alternative research. The idea is to inject RFID chips as a content of the vaccine in nanoparticles to be able to digitally track people. And it goes in line with all these futuristic smart cities, all controlled by AI, linked to facial recognition systems and all this other technology that we've got being introduced. So there's lots of evidence to show that this is the case, and it was always in the plans. And we were just saying off air before we started, a story that emerged yesterday was that Matt Hancock, less of the Han, the UK Health Secretary, has come out and said that he doesn't think it's going to be necessary to make vaccines mandatory, because he thinks enough people are going to want to take them voluntarily, because of how the mind control has worked and the fear. So that's kind of good news for the likes of us, I guess, who never would have taken a vaccine under any circumstance, to hear that we're not going to be forced to. But there's still a lot of uninformed people that are going to fall foul of these plans, and they're going to be standing in line with their sleeve rolled up saying "me next." And most conversations that you have with regular people about vaccines always seem to turn to the work of Edward Jenner, it seems, and the smallpox vaccine. And we often get this story of how the settlers, or, the invaders, to call them what they were, of the American continent are supposed to have given blankets to the Native Americans that they found there, which were allegedly infested with smallpox, knowing that they had no immunity to it because they'd never been exposed to this before. And, countless legions of them died. So this all ties into the idea of Edward Jenner doing a great job on the smallpox vaccine, because many other people would have died if he hadn't. But that story of the blankets being given to the Native Americans, I think, is a fallacy from what I've heard you say on your previous interview. So maybe you want to speak to that one.
Yes, I think there's a great... it's almost a complete history in itself, and I'm just trying to think of a couple of the authors of books that we've read. Can you remember, Dawn?
There are two parts of this. There are the smallpox blankets that were given to the natives. I think that was in the 1800s? I can't remember exactly when that was. But there was also the original invasion of America, and that Professor David Stannard wrote the book called The American Holocaust, where he shows, and we do actually talk about this in the book, where he talks about the idea that the Europeans went across to the land that's now known as America and took their smallpox germs with them, and that's what wiped out the Native Americans. And we've shown that actually can't be the case either, because, for all sorts of reasons, but we've through his work. I know the other one was Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano, also very interesting.
But what we found, and I recommend anyone to have a read at Dr. Stannard's work, because it's a real eye-opener, and it shows what really went off when the conquistadors went across to the Americas, and later the British went across to the Americas. But the story of the conquistadors going off, and it's the favourite one that everyone blames the conquistadors taking their diseases across, and the inhabitants didn't have immunity to them, is a complete fallacy. And when, as I'm pleased to say, Dr. Stannard has looked at it, and we've looked at it too, the horrors that went off when the conquistadors went over there. I mean, they were just massacring people. This is the true history of what went off over there. Not only were they massacring people who were not armed in the way they had. I mean, the conquistadors had armour and swords and muskets against people that for the large part were unarmed, or maybe they had a bow and arrow. The conquistadors even had armoured dogs that were trained to bring down people and tear them apart. I mean, it's horrendous what went off. So for the people that they couldn't kill because they saw them of no value, they enslaved the rest, because the whole idea that conquistadors had was to get gold and silver and precious minerals from the Americas. That's the sole reason for going there.
and blame the high body count on the smallpox.
And because it's much better for history to say, oh, well, it was sort of unfortunate, really. They didn't intend to do this, but, these people didn't have immunity and they died out. That wasn't the intention. But when you look at the true history, the intention was just to plunder the place, get rid of the inhabitants, enslave them, which they did, to work in the mines, the gold mines and silver mines. It was so terrible that the conquistadors didn't even bother to feed these people because they thought, well, when they die, we just get some more, which is what they did. But it got so bad that the King and Queen of Spain actually said, look, this is not really very acceptable because other people are finding out about it, what you're doing over there. You need to treat them a bit better. So things did improve a little bit. But when you look at the records, millions and millions, they completely devastated the whole of the Americas by driving people, the ones that escaped them, were then driven off their fertile lands, so they could no longer grow their crops and eat properly. So they were driven into an area where they couldn't grow things. So they were either starving to death or their nutrition was so poor that they died of things which, smallpox, where you get sort of large blisters and things that are appearing on the skin, is a typical result of lack of nutrition. It's similar to scurvy that the sailors used to suffer from in the early days of the wooden sailing ships when they were going on long journeys over to the Americas in later years. And a thing called scurvy that sailors used to get, where they got all these skin eruptions, and it was a killer. And basically, eventually they found out it was lack of vitamin C that they were suffering from, just purely as simple as that. But over a period, that can kill you. So eventually the Admiralty decided to put barrels of limes on the ships, and that's where the name the Americans often used to call the British limeys, because of that. That's where it came from, and that was to fight this deficiency so that the sailors lasted longer. So that, as I say again, the true history of what went off in the Americas, both in the southern parts and the northern parts, were always the same. The people were massacred, driven off their lands, forced into starvation, and then fell prey to all sorts of illnesses which derive from lack of food, lack of nutrition, stress, and that's the true history, which has been detailed in a couple of books. We do refer to it in our book to give people a bit of a potted version of it, so they can see that this nonsense about the people of the Americas dying off because of diseases that they were given is just totally untrue.
You come to realise that pretty much everything you were ever taught in school and everything that's in the official history books or on Wikipedia is a lie. And you can just take apart all these stories one by one, as I have been in my research over the last few years. Everything has been a lie. And when it comes to the current situation that we have, the C word, people are drawing a lot of parallels between this and the Spanish flu of 1918, and they're saying, look at that pandemic, look at how many people that wiped out. We've got the same thing here. But you cited in your book and in one of your articles online many other reasons for what could have contributed to large numbers of people dying at that time, 1918, 1919, which wouldn't have been as a result of any kind of airborne contagion or pandemic. And I think this is all pretty much connected with the First World War, isn't it?
Very much so, yes. That was another very interesting piece of research that we conducted, because, again, it was supposed to be a huge pandemic. Everyone was ill from flu and, millions of people. But one of the curious factors of that is that the numbers quoted are, could be 20 million and 50 million. And there are some that even quote, it may have been even 100 million people died from the flu. The question is, of course, that very few people who died actually were tested for their cause of death. And I think there's a very strong parallel that deaths from all sorts of causes were attributed or are now being attributed more so to that particular flu, because of course it serves their purpose to say, look, that's what happened then, millions died, so we've got to do something similar now. We found that actually there were different causes or different contributory factors depending on where in the world we were looking. So, for example, in America, we saw that there was some evidence that the soldiers in the military camps who, they should have been pretty fit and healthy, shouldn't they? They were dying or becoming seriously ill and dying in the camps. And one of the factors that was closely associated with that were vaccinations, because they were given a number of vaccines. If they showed any kind of symptoms of having flu or a cold or something, they were given aspirin. It was very popular then, only they were given the doses they were given then were much higher than were later on decided. They reduced the doses later on. And there's a particularly interesting article we discovered that showed that there's a very close correlation between aspirin toxicity and respiratory problems. So, diseases like the sort of pneumonia or conditions that are diagnosed as pneumonia. So that was in America. So that would be similar maybe in the UK and European countries. But then we discovered that India was a country that was supposed to have had the highest death toll from in that period, the so-called flu. And they were saying that it was the soldiers coming back from the conflict and taking their germs with them. Having realised that the germ theory didn't hold true, we thought, well, okay, let's have a look and see what else could have caused it. And then we discovered articles that were talking about the climatic conditions at the time, and that there was a very strong El Nino, which is a particular weather system that when it's particularly strong can affect weather conditions, can move storms or prevent or stop the typical monsoons from falling where they're supposed to fall. And so there were incredible droughts which would have led to famine, and of course lots of deaths from that in that kind of continent. And it looks extremely likely that those deaths were then put under the heading, flu. It's a question of what's convenient. And so, well, it's convenient to say they all died of flu instead of, because they took their nasty germs back home with them, rather than realising that these soldiers had been suffering dreadful conditions in the trenches in the European theatre. I mean, they'd been made to take part in that war because they were still part of India was still part of the British Empire at the time, and they were drafted in to and they worked in the trenches, and the pretty nasty conditions, especially for people who were used to living in a much more pleasant climate. And so they would in the trenches during the winter, wet and just absolutely awful. And so they were obviously not healthy when they got back, and it's nothing to do with germs.
They would have certainly been malnourished,
yes,
and certainly under heavy stress, which is, as I mentioned earlier, two of the main factors that cause huge releases of free radicals.
Another story from the history books blown to pieces.
Yeah, and of course,
yes,
at the time, the severity of this supposed flu was such that people were showing the symptoms and becoming ill and dying within a few days.
Or even hours.
And, which says something very strange is going off, which again gives the lie to soldiers going back to India, because at that time, people dying that quickly, they wouldn't have even had time to get back to India to infect anyone there, because they would have been dead on the journey. So just nothing stacks up with the stories, again, that's being given out by the authorities. And again, we detail this in the book so that people can get a much better picture of the truth of it. But you're quite right with what you said earlier, Mark. We found the same, that anything you look into of any importance, the official story is never true. And whether you go back in history or even look at present day.
Well, I've found that if you want to get to the truth of a matter, best advice is often to take what you're being told by official sources and turn it on its head 180 degrees. And if you do that, you stand a very good chance of finding the truth there. And here's another example of that. So we can see the best advice for staying healthy is to clean up your lifestyle as far as you can, watch your nutrition, take care of your diet, and try to avoid toxic influences, and try to avoid the suppression of your immune system, and try to stay in a positive vibration and a positive frame of mind. Now look at the effects that this lockdown is having on people, where we're being forced to stay in our houses. Many people get very claustrophobic when they're all shut up in a space and they can't get out and about and have freedom of movement. They get panicky. This is bad for your mental health. Many people, we've had reports of suicides. These aren't hitting the mainstream media, but word is that many people are committing suicide because they just can't stand the desolation and the isolation and the loneliness of being cooped up in their homes, particularly if they live alone. So mental health issues are being exacerbated. We've had reports of domestic violence, situations where families just can't get on with each other when they're all shut in and can't go out, and they're forced to live like this. Then you have people staying in voluntarily because they're terrified of this virus. They think it's everywhere, floating around. So they're not going out, they're not getting enough exercise, they're not getting enough access to direct sunlight, they're not getting enough fresh air, and all these things are contributing to ill health. They have to be, because they're bad influences. So here's another example of official advice. Oh, we're keeping you safe. The only reason we're telling you not to go out and about is to save lives. Stay home and save lives, and keep yourself safe. But in actual fact, people are doing themselves great damage by being locked up. And so the advice from the government, once again, is the 180 degree opposite of what it should be. It's not keeping people safe, it's doing great harm.
Yes, I agree entirely. And as we know, they're manipulating the death figures. We know there can be no deaths from this so-called virus. There can be no deaths. So the numbers that the government's put out are inaccurate. But also, lots more people are dying at home because they either can't or won't go to a hospital. But what's happening is it's happening in America, and this was one of the things that Dr. Andy Kaufman told us. The CDC over there is sort of instructing doctors to actually, if in doubt, always write death from this unnameable virus. The
C word.
The C word, yes, without any tests. They're actually being instructed to do that, which gives you an idea of just how desperate the authorities are, but just how corrupt the whole system is, to try and make this whole thing look like it is really something when it's nothing at all. So the more you look at it, as I'm sure you have done, I know we certainly have, you know that there's obviously some much more something more to do with
ulterior motives.
There's definitely an ulterior motive, and it's sort of a power grab, isn't it? It's a control grab over people. That's the only thing that you can see that's behind this, because they've never been able to do anything like this before on such a large scale.
And the only reason it's succeeded so far is because vast numbers of people are just taking everything the government tells them, everything the mainstream media tells them, and they're believing it. They're not thinking to go and do research for themselves to see whether this information stacks up, because they've been trained, they've been mind control programmed to trust these authoritative sources, and never to imagine that they might be lying to them. I did just speak to the lack of knowledge that the average person has about health and the human body, and the nature of viruses and diseases and stuff, and I actually knew very little about this myself before all of this. I've researched it during this whole narrative to get myself up to speed with it, but before all this I knew very little about it. But it's just the fact that people seem incapable and unwilling to do their own research, because this information that you've uncovered is available to anyone, right? Anyone can find this stuff out there. I found this stuff out. You just need the will to do it, a bit of time, and an internet connection. And we've all got time now, haven't we? But, people just don't seem to want to research stuff for themselves, and, that's the only way this narrative has been able to succeed. The only reason why people are walking around with face masks on and are terrified of the next person in the street, and it's so depressing to see, it's so frustrating when you realise it's all based on lies.
Yes, and it's a great shame that people are even reluctant to learn the truth. There's a certain inbuilt resistance that anyone like ourselves, if you try to tell people about it, there's this reluctance to actually believe that what you can be telling them is the truth. Because I come back to what I said earlier, they just cannot believe that government/medical association could be wrong. And so even when you come along and say, well, look, I can give you examples, I can give you scientific records to show that what I'm saying is true, for the most part, people don't want to know even. So there's this bit inbuilt reluctance to even learn. So it is very much an uphill struggle, which is, again, very disappointing.
Well, this is why it's so encouraging when you get medical professionals like Andy Kaufman and Rashid Buttar and many of these others that have come forward. And, they've got qualifications. You were speaking earlier, David, about how people tend to trust someone in a white coat. It's that authority figure thing. So there are qualified medical professionals with proven track records who are coming forward offering alternative takes on the narrative. And they're telling people that the government is lying to them. Understandably, there haven't been many, because anyone that does come forward with this type of information, that's the end of their career, that's the end of their salary, that's the end of their pension plan, and people don't want to lose these things. But some brave souls have come forward, they've put truth first before any personal agendas, and they have given this alternative information. So it's great when people from the inside do come forward as whistleblowers, insiders. Dawn, did you want to add something there?
Yes, well, it was going back to what Dave was saying and what you were saying before as well. The whole idea of why people are afraid, because that's one of the main mechanisms of what's going on at the moment. It's to make people fearful of this virus. This thing called a virus, but it's also been part of social conditioning, because I know that's something that you look into and have looked at, with the entertainment industry. Sure. I mean, there have been all these films like, Contagion I can't remember them because I never watched them, because having done this, yes, all of that kind of thing. Because doing this research and realising a long time ago that germs were not the problem, I just can't watch that because I'd probably end up shouting at the screen. But this kind of social conditioning has been around, so people are now scared of these things because they are nasty and they can kill people, and so they have been entrained. It's part of the conditioning. So now it's all playing out very nicely that people are now being afraid, and they are obeying this 2-meter thing and thinking that it makes a difference, that the virus just can't manage that extra bit. They can, I think, like you said, sort of 1.9 meters, and then they say, oh no, can't go any further.
Oh, and it takes 5 minutes off at 8 p.m. every Thursday. Did you know that? It just kind of holds back, and then when everyone's gone in, it's back again.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's just incredible. Isn't it insane that you've got people, I mean, I've seen social media chat threads where this sort of conversation is going on, and you've got people saying that even when the government tells us it's safe to go out, I'm still going to stay in my house. I'm so afraid of this thing, and I'm not going back to work yet. So people are policing themselves and enslaving themselves. You don't even need a slave master anymore.
Yeah. As you said earlier, and it's unfathomable to us, who are free thinkers. We question everything, but the majority of people, as we found, don't. And it's the people who've organised this, those dark powers that sit behind government, must be thinking, crikey, this was so easy. We never thought it would be as easy as this, and they've got away with it, so far at least. So we have to keep trying. As I say, I was very pleased to see that, as I mentioned earlier, that today the government is being taken to court because they're being challenged that everything they've done is illegal. and they've got until 4 p.m. today to answer the summons that's been put to them by the legal team at Wedlake Bell in London, and they've got a QC, Mr. Havers, who's taken the case up, and he's got quite a good track record of human rights. So he seems like he's the right guy. So I'm sort of very hopeful that they'll be able to put up a good case. The only downside is, I've read through their 20-page document which they've put to the government and made some notes from it, and the right is on their side, if you like. It does show that the government has acted completely illegally with everything. But of course, as anyone knows, we have what I call a legal system in this country, but we don't necessarily have a justice system in this country, and the two are very different. So although legality may be on the side of Wedlake Bell, it's whether justice will prevail. I would like to think that it will.
Well, as we record this, it's the 7th of May, and this was supposed to have been the day when Boris Johnson announced some sort of easing of the lockdown measures. But I don't know if you heard about this, but I got told yesterday that apparently, according to official figures, there's been an unexpected upward spike again in C-word deaths. So we were told that things had plateaued off and that the death rate was starting to fall, and then yesterday, surprise, surprise, of all the days it could have happened, there's a big spike and it's going back up just before we were due to get some announcements on lockdown measures being eased. But what I think we're witnessing here is different factions, and it seems the terrified, mask-wearing BBC believers who are, swallowing everything the government tells them about this, are going further and further into fear and mind control and self-policing. And then, on the other hand, you've got large numbers of people who are starting to realise they can see that this whole thing is a sham, and they can see that we're being lied to. There's more and more insiders coming forward. There's more and more people sharing alternative, truthful information like this. That Simon Dolan action against the government isn't the only legal case. I've heard of 3 others. There's Robin Tilbrook representing the English Democrats, who's taken some kind of legal action, and there's 2 other cases I've heard of as well. And all these measures do send a very clear statement to the evildoers, the controllers, that we're not all dumb, we're not all stupid. Some of us are capable of critical thought. Some of us place value on our rights and our freedoms, and we realise that they have absolutely zero right to try and take these away from us. We're free, sovereign beings, and we will fight to maintain that natural status. So any kind of message that we can send to the control system that they don't have all of us. And not only that, but there's more and more people waking up. We're getting more and more numbers on our side. It can only be a positive thing. So, any way that we have of sending a statement out, some people place value on demonstrations and protests, and others will say these don't change anything. Well, they might not change anything, but again, they do send the statement that there are some of us whose minds you haven't got yet. And I think that's only going to increase exponentially, hopefully, in the coming weeks.
Yes.
That's our hope too. And as I said earlier, with the feedback that we get from people that have read our book and know of us, are very encouraging. Because when we wrote it, because it's quite challenging, the book, when we're telling people everything they thought they knew about disease is wrong, some people might be quite insulted by that, but not so. We've had lots and lots of encouragement, more so than we dared hope for, and including from the members of the medical establishment, some who have come out of the woodwork, and others that are still required to remain secret, if you like. But so it's been very encouraging. So we know there are lots of people out there, and we've just got to keep pushing this and keep pushing back against what these evildoers are trying to force onto us. Yeah.
And we just want to, I was just going to say, we just want to get the information out to people that there is nothing to be afraid of, that this fear is completely baseless.
It's purely manufactured. There is no, people are not going to get knocked down by some dreadful illness of any sort, whether it's this present made-up thing or anything else. They're not. It doesn't exist. Exactly. You can live a natural, healthy life and be perfectly safe.
It's kind of ironic because these past few weeks, I've never felt healthier. because I'm sleeping much better because I'm not working anymore. I used to do a driving job, and I used to have to get up at 4 in the morning and all kinds of crazy times. So I'm getting a full night's sleep now. I'm going out every single day for as long as possible. I'm getting access to sunlight and nature. It's been beautiful spring weather for the last few weeks, and I've been out in all of that. I've been eating better than I normally do, and I've never felt healthier. And yet you have all these other people thinking, oh my God, we're going to get ill. There's all this disease in the air. And that's just not the case. And, you know, there's got to be many medical professionals, doctors, virologists, other kind of scientists who must know that this whole thing is a sham. They must be sitting there looking at what the government is telling us and what the BBC is telling us, and there's got to be a voice in their heads going, no, 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 this is not right. And yet they're staying silent because of the reasons we discussed earlier. They don't want to lose their salary or whatever. But they must have very troubling thoughts at night, and their conscience must be poking them in the ribs every day. Don't you think?
I think so, and
I'd like to think so.
Andy Kaufman has said that, you know, because some of his doctor friends have deserted him over this because he's come out, if you like, to speak about it. And as he said, you know, they're afraid they're going to lose their Mercedes, you know, and their private education for the kids and the big house they live in, and not least of which is the huge debts that they accrue whilst they're training. So it's the golden handcuffs, you know. They've got to maintain that level of income to pay off their debts and to fund the lifestyle that they've got, becoming used to. And most of them will stuff their conscience in a little box somewhere and put it in a cupboard out the way and carry on earning the money. You know, I mean, he openly admits this, and but many don't, and that's the sad thing. But one day, you know, there will be a day of reckoning for them, and hopefully their consciences will get the better of them, and more of them will start to speak out and tell the truth.
They've got to make a big decision. Which side are they going to be on? Because history is being written, and you've got to choose a side. And if they choose the wrong side, they may end up regretting it for, the rest of their days. And also there's the implication on the soul. I mean, I'm getting metaphysical and spiritual here, but, you know, there are consequences for the actions that you choose to take in this life, and they follow you way beyond this physical life when it's all done. That's just my little statement there. But also, as well as doctors, what about all these mainstream media broadcasters and so-called journalists that are, you know, propagating the official line on all this? So much fear and so much suffering and so much death by suicide might have been caused by the lockdown measures, and none of this would have taken place if there weren't mainstream media outlets and people populating them, propping up the official story, reading whatever script is given to them, and scaring everyone to death about this supposed deadly disease that just isn't there. I mean, many of these people are going to have to take a long, hard look at themselves in the mirror as well. And I would like to think that their conscience is going to be poking them in the ribs too and saying, what are you doing? What have you been a part of? So I think they've got some soul searching to do as well. Because as far as I'm concerned, these people are traitors. This is straight treason, peddling lies and deceptions, especially when you know it to be so. It's just unforgivable.
I think the majority, yes, I'm glad you said so-called journalists, because in the true sense they're not, of course. They're just repeaters, aren't they? They just get given a script. They're a talking head. They get given a script and they just regurgitate it, so without a thought in their head. I don't credit very many of them with any real mental faculties at all. As I say, they're just in a well-paid job, get themselves on the telly, a nice salary, and live very well off it just for reading a script. That's all really they do. They're not journalists at all, and that's the majority of them, you know. So it's more part of the entertainment industry. I see more of their little antics that they do, whether it's with so-called talking dogs or Mrs. Smith down the road who's learnt to play the violin while she's been off on lockdown, or some such stupid thing. Yeah. I mean, it is just ridiculous. It's just entertainment, and people fall for it. But yes, I agree with you. I'd like to think there will be a day of reckoning for these people as well, because, again, this could never have been carried out in the way it has been without the media, and it's been total blanket information coming from them every time you switch a television on or a radio on. And of course, as we know from anyone who did look at that last year in October at event 201, this is exactly what they plan to do. And I recommend people have a look. If that's still up on the internet, they'll see just how this was a planned thing. It didn't just happen sort of earlier this year. They were planning it. They've been planning it for a long time, but they were really talking about it in earnest in October, 18th of October, I think it was last year. And here we are living through it, what they were talking about.
I mean, that alone should be a wake-up call to the masses, that this whole thing didn't just randomly mutate out of nowhere, out of bats in China, and nobody knew it was going to happen. Just the fact that it was being planned for 2 months before it broke. And obviously the mainstream media doesn't ever talk about Event 201, but again, if the will is there to find these things out, the information is there on the internet, and there's no excuse for anyone not knowing about this stuff, especially with the large amount of alternative voices like us that are, shouting from the rooftops to anyone that will listen about all this stuff. So it seems to me that the situation we have could end up being humanity's worst dystopian nightmare, or it could be the greatest opportunity we've ever had to break down the lies, the deception, the darkness, the evil, and, take back some of our own power. It could go either way, and I try and stay focused on bringing about the latter situation with my intent and my focus. I look for any glimmers of hope and optimism that there are, and I'm seeing a few. I'm seeing a few things that are encouraging me, and I think we're at the stage where things still could go either way, but I'm focused on an optimistic outcome. How do you folks feel about that?
Yeah, we're the same.
Exactly the same. It is a real turning point that we're in, and I agree with you entirely. And I think it's the greatest opportunity they've had, if you like, to get complete control, and it's the greatest opportunity we have to push that back and stop it ever happening again. Because I think once people realise just how they've been lied to and the extent of the lies, they'll never trust any of these people again, either in the governmental systems or the medical systems. These two, this whole thing is based on what the government lies and misinformation by the media. So it's a real opportunity for people to realise that and never trust any of these people again, and to be able to get control back of their own lives. So yeah, real turning point.
And they're scaring us to death with all this talk of, there could be a second wave in the winter, it could come back. And it's like they're almost prepping us for it because it's been decided already. And they're using that to scare everyone into conformity. So we've got to put this narrative down now. Don't wait till there's a second spike, because then we might get put into an even more severe lockdown according to what they want to do to us. Now is the time for this whole thing to be exposed as the sham that it is. Otherwise, the danger is they could keep saying, there's a new strain of it, there's a new wave of it that's come out, and it's all lies, it's all nonsense. Now is the time.
Absolutely. And everyone needs to pull together. As people have often said, there's a lot more of us than there is of them. And it's only force of numbers on our side. I mean, if people just outside sort of Sainsbury's or wherever just refused to do this 2 metre thing and just said, well, let's all go in, guys, come on, never mind about this. I mean, what are they going to do? Sainsbury's call the police and arrest everybody in the shop? I don't think so. So it just needs people, it doesn't have to be a violent thing. I would never encourage people to do that, but just to take back their freedom and stop acting like controlled dogs or something. As you say, we're free human beings and we should start acting like it and not put up with this nonsense.
That's right. And we do no harm. We seek to do no harm, and if I thought that me going out in public would be putting other people's lives at risk, I would take that decision myself, not to put other people in danger like that. I don't need any government to tell me. It's taking personal responsibility and taking on an understanding of universal law, do no harm. But that's not the case. I know that when I go into Sainsbury's or anywhere else, I'm doing nobody else any harm whatsoever. Therefore, I've got a right to go about my business freely as everybody else does.
Correct, yes.
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, we agree with the same principle, first do no harm, or, like the Hippocratic Oath. And knowing that there is no virus that anyone's carrying that they can spread to somebody else, so they cannot do somebody else any harm. I mean, I've had this for absolutely years. Once I understood so many people sort of, sneeze around me or whatever and say, they're not feeling well, and said, you better keep away from me because you might catch whatever it is. And I said, don't worry, you've got nothing I can catch, because I've known that. And that's also very empowering. And I think that's another part of why we're really trying to talk to as many people as possible to get the message out that it's about, like you say, taking back our own power, taking back responsibility for what we for our actions and for everything that we do, but also knowing that there is no virus or even bacterium that we can spread to somebody else and make somebody else ill. That really is
there is no science to support that. I mean, true science.
Absolutely,
there is no true science to support that. And as I say, we spent 10 years looking for it. We didn't set out to prove the medical establishment wrong. We looked for the evidence to support what they said, and there isn't any. It's as simple as that.
So are there any kinds of diseases that can be spread, that can be airborne and can go from person to person then, whatever label you put on them, whether it's a virus or anything else? Is there anything that can be spread that way?
No, none at all. And in the book we've not talked about it today, but we also talk about the so-called autoimmune diseases and as the medical establishment calls them, non-communicable diseases. We talk about those as well. I'm thinking of sort of heart disease and sort of diabetes and cancer, of course, yeah. So we talk about them and we show what causes them and, again, how they can be prevented. And, again, none of them are anything to do with germs. There are well-documented information. There's well-documented information to show how those things are caused. And most of the non-communicable diseases are caused by toxins of one sort or another. And we show in the book where those things come from and how they affect the body and how, if not, you're not taking the right sort of nutrients, how the body can be overwhelmed and how they can damage the sort of nervous system. And this includes electromagnetic radiation. We show the mechanisms that these things work through to cause the damage to the body that they do. So we feel in the book, and again, I'll mention why it's so big, is that we've tried to cover every angle, both human and animal, as to what the diseases are, how they're caused, and therefore how you can prevent them. And we've never found anything, again, in animal or human, that is caused by a germ. Not one thing, and no evidence for that.
Sure. So, the book, What Really Makes You Ill? Why Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease Is Wrong. Just let people know where they can get that and any other resources online that you'd like to direct people to with your work. Go ahead with all of that.
Okay, well, yes, as you kindly said, that's the title of the book, and you can get it through any Amazon outlet around the world. Unfortunately, we have to use that. We do have a website, which is whatreallymakesyouill.com, where you can read more about the book. We've got links on there to various interviews that we've done, and this will be one of them. And we're slowly putting up more articles so that people can read. It gives them more information. I should also mention as well through Amazon, because we've done a Kindle version of the book, so obviously which is less expensive. So people can get that, and that's with the sort of some of the ridiculous things that we've heard about delivery dates, that Amazon are using excuses why people can't get the book as quickly as they ought to be able to. So the Kindle version people can get much quicker, of course, almost instantaneously. So so whatreallymakesyouill.com, people are welcome to come to. There's an email address on there where if there's things they don't understand in the book, they can write to us. We do ask people not to use it like a doctor's surgery. We're not there to give individual advice on people's individual ailments. We're not allowed to do that. But again, that just shows the stranglehold the authorities have on individuals. So it's the way they control the information. But please get in touch if you want to. I think you'll find the book very interesting. It'll be very enlightening, and it will set you free from a lot of worries.
Do you have a stash of books there that you mail out to people directly?
No, we don't. We decided not to do that because we get requests from all over the world. We do have a few, but we reserve them for certain individuals like yourself. But we didn't want to because we don't have the time, to be honest. We've been inundated with emails and requests for all sorts of things. So, and we're in the process of writing another book anyway. So we really don't have the time to be able to be packaging things up and sending them all around the world. So we let Amazon take care of that for us.
And also, there's no post leaving the UK to go overseas right now, which I've discovered, because people from America and other places have asked me to mail my book out to them, and I've established from the post office that no mail is leaving the UK. So I'm only able to send my books to people within the UK because the planes have all been grounded, because, otherwise the pilots might get this terrible virus that's going around, and it could come into their cockpit and go up their nostrils, and they would die. So that's only a sensible precaution, I think you said with your book and all the information you've put in there, you've got about 40 pages of direct citations to show where all your information came from. Is that right?
Correct, yes. So people can check sources and look for themselves. 40 pages. So there's a lot of information there if people want to take it further. We've tried to make the book as without jargon. We've tried to make it as easy to read as possible, and we've written it sort of a bit like a novel, a bit like a detective story. We recommend people start at the beginning, and they'll see how the evidence builds for the case we make throughout the book. And also, of course, we explain how people can stay healthy. Natural health is exactly what we say, natural, and doesn't require special lotions and potions, and it just doesn't. Natural health is a natural thing. The body is extremely intelligent. It's a self-regulating organism. You just have to maintain a few basic principles, and the body can look after itself. And we make that quite clear in the book, and we've lived our lives like that and continue to do so in a healthy life without any reference to the medical establishment.
Okay, Dawn and David, thanks very much for coming on the show today. As we said, history is being written day by day, and the situation is changing day by day, and that's going to continue. And I like to think that at some point in the not too distant future, the likes of us are going to be able to kick back over a pint in the pub somewhere and say, God, spring 2020, what a bloody nightmare that was. Do you remember? Well, we're all living our lives freely. I'll even buy the first round, if that day comes to pass. Well, thanks for standing up and doing the right thing and putting truthful information out there. It's very much needed. I have great respect to everyone that's doing that in these times, and I've got contempt, to be honest, for those that could be but aren't and are just making excuses. So you two are undertaking right action, and thank you for that, and thank you for your contributions, and all the best with the book.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Bye for now.
This is just a wrap.
I'm picking up